If you approve that transfer tonight, sir, by sunrise retirement funds across 3 states will start disappearing. The voice cut through Whitmore Capital's executive boardroom so suddenly that even the city noise beyond the 72nd floor windows seemed to stop breathing. Richard Whitmore slowly lifted his eyes from the glowing merger documents spread across the polished black table, while a dozen executives turned toward the source of the interruption with visible disbelief. Naomi Carter stood beside the silver coffee cart near the wall, one hand wrapped around a folded linen towel, the other gripping a printed financial summary she was never supposed to touch. For a second, nobody spoke. Then came the laughter. Quiet at first, sharp little chuckles bouncing beneath the cold, recessed lighting. Evelyn Brooks leaned back in her leather chair and crossed her arms slowly, her diamond bracelet catching the pale Manhattan skyline behind her. "I'm sorry," she said with a smile too polished to be kind. "Did the maid just try to lecture a room full of analysts?" More laughter spread around the table. Naomi felt the heat rise into her cheeks, but she didn't lower her eyes. The massive digital market board reflected across the glass walls beside her, glowing green and gold like a promise everyone in the room trusted too much. Richard Whitmore remained silent, fingers resting near a silver pin worth more than Naomi's monthly rent. "Sir," Naomi continued carefully, her voice calm despite the pressure squeezing her chest. "The collateral chain attached to the Singapore transfer is unstable. The debt exposure was hidden inside secondary packaging." One executive muttered something under his breath. Another shook his head with open annoyance. Evelyn gave a dry laugh. "This is exactly why employees shouldn't wander into discussions they can't possibly understand." Naomi swallowed hard. She knew she should stop talking. Every instinct told her to apologize, lower her head, disappear back into the service hallway where people like her were expected to stay invisible. But she couldn't, because 3 hours earlier, while replacing water glasses after a private strategy session, she had seen the figures left glowing on a forgotten monitor. One number had immediately felt wrong. Not strange. Dangerous. The kind of dangerous Naomi recognized because she had spent most of her life surviving consequences created by powerful people in expensive rooms. Her mother's medical debt, their eviction notice in Brooklyn, the student loans she never finished paying after leaving Columbia 2 semesters before graduation. Numbers could ruin lives long before they ruined companies. "You're overreacting," Evelyn said coldly. "You saw a few charts and suddenly think you understand billion-dollar liquidity structures?" Naomi slowly placed the printed report onto the edge of the conference table. Her fingers trembled slightly against the paper. "No, ma'am," she replied softly. "I think somebody buried toxic leverage inside the transfer because they assumed nobody would look closely enough before Asian markets opened tonight." The room felt quieter this time. Not silent, but quieter. One young analyst near the end of the table stopped typing. Richard Whitmore finally looked directly at Naomi for the first time since she spoke. His gray eyes narrowed slightly, unreadable beneath the reflection of scrolling market numbers flashing across the wall screens. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline, low and distant. Naomi could suddenly hear her own heartbeat. Then Richard reached for the financial packet in front of him, and the room watched in confused silence as the billionaire slowly turned to the exact page Naomi had warned them about. Richard Whitmore stared at the page for several long seconds while the boardroom remained frozen beneath the cold white glow of recessed ceiling lights. The rain outside thickened against the glass walls, streaking the Manhattan skyline in blurred silver lines. Naomi stood completely still near the coffee cart, trying to steady her breathing as the silence in the room shifted into something heavier than mockery. Richard's thumb slowly dragged across the edge of the document before he looked toward the younger analyst seated halfway down the table. "Run the secondary exposure chain again," he said quietly. Evelyn Brooks let out a short laugh of disbelief. "Richard, come on. We already audited the package twice." "Run it again," he repeated without raising his voice. The atmosphere changed immediately. Chairs rolled softly across the polished floor as laptops reopened. Fingers struck keyboards faster now. The giant market screens reflected streams of moving numbers across the dark marble walls while Naomi remained near the doorway, painfully aware that every eye in the room still saw her as someone who did not belong there. One executive adjusted his cufflinks and muttered, "This is ridiculous." Another whispered something about legal liability and public embarrassment. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly toward the silver service tray beside her. Tiny circles of water from untouched glasses reflected the ceiling lights like trembling coins. She suddenly remembered sitting beside her mother years earlier at a folding table in their small Brooklyn apartment while overdue bills covered every inch of the surface. Her mother used to stare at numbers the same way people stared at storms coming through broken windows. Quiet, exhausted, waiting for impact. Where exactly did you even learn this terminology? Evelyn asked sharply without looking up from her screen. Naomi hesitated. I studied economics before leaving school. That finally pulled several faces toward her again. You studied economics? One executive repeated, unable to hide his skepticism. Naomi nodded once. At Columbia. A few eyebrows lifted. Someone in the back actually stopped typing. Evelyn leaned back slowly in her chair, lips pressed into a thin smile that carried no warmth at all. And now you are serving coffee in boardrooms. Naomi felt the sting behind the words immediately, but she kept her posture calm. Life changes fast, she answered softly. The room went quiet again, but this silence felt different now. Less amused, more uncertain. Then suddenly, one of the younger analysts froze mid-keystroke. Daniel Reeves stared at his monitor, blinking hard as if he hoped the numbers would rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. Wait, he murmured. Nobody responded at first. He swallowed, visibly before speaking louder. The collateral reserve ratio is not balanced. Evelyn turned toward him with immediate irritation. What are you talking about? Daniel rotated his screen toward Richard. His face had gone pale beneath the cold boardroom lighting. The Singapore assets are backed by leveraged debt 3 layers deep. If Tokyo reacts badly to the overnight transfer, pension exposure gets triggered automatically. The room shifted all at once. Executives leaned forward. Someone cursed under their breath. Naomi felt her stomach tighten as the reality finally reached them. Richard's jaw hardened while Daniel continued scanning through the files. My God, the analyst whispered. It spread straight into retirement funds. The rain outside slammed harder against the windows now, loud enough to echo faintly through the room. Evelyn quickly grabbed the report from Richard's side and scanned the highlighted sections herself. The confidence drained from her face line by line. No, she muttered quietly. No, that cannot be right. Naomi watched her fingers tighten against the paper. Richard slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi again, and this time there was no dismissal left in his expression. Only calculation. Only the terrifying realization that a woman carrying a linen towel had just seen the collapse coming before anyone else in the room. The sound of typing grew frantic across the boardroom as analysts reopened files they had already approved hours earlier. Market projections flashed across towering screens in waves of red and gold, while the storm outside swallowed most of Manhattan in dark rolling clouds. Naomi remained near the far wall beside the untouched coffee cart, her shoulders tense beneath the plain charcoal housekeeping uniform that suddenly felt even smaller inside a room full of million-dollar decisions. Nobody laughed anymore. Daniel Reeves pushed his chair back abruptly and stood halfway from the table, eyes locked on the numbers racing across his monitor. The debt layering is hidden through offshore restructuring, he said carefully, his voice thinner now. If this transfer closes tonight, the exposure chain reaches public retirement. Funds by morning. A low murmur spread through the room. One executive loosened his tie. Another immediately reached for his phone before Richard Whitmore raised one hand sharply. No calls, he said. The room obeyed instantly. Naomi watched Richard's expression harden beneath the cold light, reflecting off the windows behind him. He no longer looked irritated. He looked cornered. Evelyn Brooks stood slowly from her seat and walked toward the giant digital screen at the front of the room. Her high heels struck the marble floor in measured clicks that echoed beneath the silence. This could still be contained, she said quickly, though her confidence sounded forced now. The leverage ratios may not trigger immediately. Naomi spoke before she could stop herself. They will if Tokyo panics. Evelyn turned toward her immediately. Nobody asked you. The words landed sharp enough to cut the air again, but Naomi noticed something different this time. Evelyn sounded nervous. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, studying Naomi with growing intensity. Explain, he said. Every face turned toward her again. Naomi hesitated only briefly before stepping closer to the table. The skyline behind the executives glowed dimly through sheets of rain, and for a moment, she felt 16 years old again, standing in front of a college classroom with hands shaking during presentations she could barely afford to attend. But numbers had always made more sense to her than people did. Numbers revealed truth long before pride allowed anyone else to admit it. The transfer package depends on confidence, Naomi said carefully. But confidence disappears fast when leverage gets exposed publicly. Once Asian markets react, automated sell-offs trigger here in the United States before opening bell. Daniel nodded almost immediately. She is right, he admitted quietly. Naomi continued, her voice calm despite the tension pulling tight across her chest. Then pension funds try to protect themselves. Retirement accounts freeze. Banks panic. Everyone starts selling at once. Silence followed her words like falling snow. One executive slowly removed his glasses and rubbed both hands across his face. Another stared blankly toward the market board as though trying to imagine headlines that had not happened yet. Richard finally stood from his chair. The movement alone shifted the entire room. How much time do we have? He asked. Daniel checked the international clock displayed across his screen. 92 minutes until Tokyo opens. A cold stillness settled over the boardroom. Outside, lightning flashed somewhere behind the clouds, illuminating the glass walls in brief silver light. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the polished table, suddenly aware again of the cleaning towel still folded in her hand. She looked completely out of place beside billion-dollar contracts and glowing financial models. Yet somehow she was the only person who had seen the danger before it reached the edge of disaster. Evelyn crossed her arms tightly. Even if she is partially correct, there is no guarantee the markets react that aggressively. Richard turned toward her slowly. Are you willing to bet retirement funds across 3 states on that? Evelyn said nothing. Nobody did. The room that had mocked Naomi Carter less than an hour earlier now sat trapped inside the terrifying possibility that the quiet black maid standing beside the coffee cart might have just saved them all from financial collapse. Richard Whitmore walked slowly toward the wall of windows overlooking lower Manhattan while the boardroom behind him dissolved into controlled panic. Phones vibrated silently across the polished table. Analysts whispered over overlapping spreadsheets. Rainwater crawled down the glass in crooked silver lines, bending the city lights into something distorted and fragile. Naomi stood near the end of the room, uncertain whether she should stay or disappear before someone remembered she was never supposed to be part of this conversation. Her pulse still hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face calm. Years of surviving embarrassment had taught her how to stand still even when everything inside her wanted to retreat. Daniel Reeves continued typing rapidly, eyes darting between international market feeds and internal exposure reports. The risk chain is worse than we thought, he said carefully. If this deal closes, every automated system connected to the pension portfolio reacts within minutes. One executive suddenly stood from his chair. Then we halt the transfer immediately. We cannot, Evelyn Brooks interrupted sharply. Backing out now destroys investor confidence before markets even open. Richard remained facing the storm outside. And signing it destroys retirement funds, he replied quietly. Nobody answered him. Naomi lowered her gaze toward the dark marble floor reflecting faint gold light beneath everyone's shoes. She could smell burnt espresso from the untouched coffee station beside her and the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the cold air-conditioned room. The contrast almost made her dizzy. Men worth hundreds of millions of dollars were suddenly terrified by the same thing her family had feared her entire life. Losing everything overnight. Richard finally turned back toward the table. Who approved the offshore restructuring? A tense silence followed. Evelyn folded her arms tighter. The compliance division cleared it 2 weeks ago. Under whose authority? Richard asked. Daniel hesitated before answering carefully. Most of the approvals came through Preston Hale's division. Several executives exchanged nervous glances immediately. Naomi noticed it at once. Fear moved differently through wealthy people. Quiet, controlled, hidden beneath polished faces and expensive watches. But it was still fear. Richard's expression darkened. Get Hale on the phone. One assistant hurried from the room. Naomi instinctively stepped backward toward the service hallway, hoping no one noticed her leaving. but Richard's voice stopped her before she reached the door. "Miss Carter." The room turned toward her again. Naomi slowly faced him. "Yes, sir." Richard studied her for a long moment. "How did you catch this?" Evelyn looked visibly irritated by the question itself. Naomi hesitated before answering. "Because the numbers did not match the confidence in the room." Several executives frowned slightly. Naomi swallowed and continued softly. "People only hide risk when they think nobody beneath them is paying attention." Silence settled again. Daniel glanced toward Naomi with something close to admiration now. Evelyn, however, looked away entirely. Richard walked back toward the table slowly. "You said you studied economics." "Yes, sir." "Why did you leave?" Naomi's fingers tightened around the folded linen towel in her hand. For a moment she considered lying. It would have been easier, cleaner, but exhaustion made honesty simpler tonight. "My mother got sick," she answered quietly. Hospital bills became more important than tuition. Nobody mocked her this time. Outside, thunder rolled deeper across the skyline, while the giant digital clocks on the wall counted down the minutes until Asian markets opened. 81 minutes left. The number glowed bright red above the financial screens like a warning nobody could ignore anymore. Suddenly, the conference room doors swung open, and an assistant hurried inside, carrying a tablet with both hands. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "Tokyo traders are already questioning the transfer structure online." The room froze again. Daniel looked back toward his monitor, face draining pale under the cold white lights. "It is starting early," he whispered. Naomi felt the atmosphere shift completely then. This was no longer theory, no longer debate. The collapse had already begun moving toward them across the Pacific like a storm nobody in this building had seen coming until it was almost too late. The giant digital clocks above the trading screens continued counting down in bright red numbers, while tension spread through Whitmore Capital like a crack moving through glass. 74 minutes until Tokyo opened. Nobody in the boardroom looked comfortable anymore. Jackets had come off. Ties loosened. Half-empty coffee cups sat abandoned across the polished table, while analysts worked through projections with trembling urgency. Naomi remained near the service hallway, trying to make herself smaller again now that the danger she warned them about had become impossible to ignore. But every few seconds someone glanced toward her anyway. Not with mockery this time. With unease. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of the room, studying live market feeds, flashing across 3 massive wall screens. The reflection of collapsing futures moved across his face in streaks of red light. "How far is the exposure spreading?" he asked without looking away from the screens. Daniel Reeves swallowed hard before answering. "Singapore and Hong Kong traders are already discussing irregular leverage activity online. If enough firms pull out at once, automated systems here in the United States will react before opening bell." One executive slammed a hand softly against the table in frustration. "Then stop the transfer now. We cannot freeze it without triggering an investigation." Evelyn Brooks snapped immediately. "Do you understand what happens if regulators see this before we stabilize investor confidence?" Naomi watched the argument unfold beneath the cold lights and felt something familiar settle inside her chest. Pride. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Just the quiet realization that powerful people often spent more energy protecting appearances than protecting ordinary lives. Her mother used to say the same thing whenever landlords ignored broken heating systems until winter came. Problems only mattered when wealthy people started feeling cold too. Suddenly, one of the screens flashed bright yellow. Daniel's face drained instantly. "Oh no." The room turned toward him. "What?" Richard demanded. Daniel enlarged the trading feed with shaking fingers. A financial blog in Tokyo just leaked concerns about hidden pension exposure tied to American retirement portfolios. Silence crashed into the room. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. Richard stepped forward quickly. "How many people have seen it?" "Thousands already," Daniel answered. "The story is spreading." Evelyn grabbed the edge of the table hard enough for her knuckles to pale beneath the overhead lights. "This cannot happen tonight." Naomi looked toward the windows where rain hammered the glass so hard it blurred the entire skyline into gray distortion. Somewhere below them, millions of ordinary people were sleeping peacefully inside apartments and suburban homes, completely unaware that their retirement savings sat on the edge of collapse because of decisions made in rooms like this one. Richard slowly turned toward Naomi again. Miss Carter. His voice sounded different now. Lower. More careful. Naomi straightened instinctively. Yes, sir. If you were sitting in my chair right now, what would you do? The entire room went still again. Even Evelyn looked stunned by the question. Naomi hesitated. Her housekeeping badge hung awkwardly against her uniform while billion-dollar executives waited for her answer beneath the cold white glow of market screens. For one impossible moment, the room no longer saw her as invisible. Naomi took a slow breath. Tell the truth before the market discovers the lie for you. Nobody spoke. Richard studied her carefully while thunder rolled across Manhattan again, deeper this time. Then one of the assistants rushed back into the room, carrying another tablet. Sir, he said breathlessly. Preston Hale just left his apartment. His office says he is refusing all calls. Daniel looked back toward the trading screens and whispered under his breath, he knows. The words hung in the air like smoke. Richard's jaw tightened instantly. Evelyn looked away toward the windows. Naomi suddenly understood something terrifying then. This was never just a mistake buried in paperwork. Somebody had known exactly what they were doing. And now, with markets waking up overseas minute by minute, the people responsible were already trying to disappear before the collapse reached American soil. The boardroom slowly emptied into smaller pockets of controlled chaos while emergency calls spread through Whitmore Capital like sparks through dry wire. Analysts rushed between offices carrying tablets and printed reports. Legal teams filled conference rooms down the hallway. The polished marble corridors that usually felt cold and untouchable now carried the sound of hurried footsteps and anxious voices bouncing beneath the recessed lights. Naomi slipped quietly out of the boardroom unnoticed by most of the executives too consumed by the unfolding crisis to care where the maid had gone. She moved toward the service elevator at the end of the hallway, her cleaning cart rolling softly beside her. The silver wheels squeaked faintly against the polished floor. For the first time in hours, she could finally breathe without feeling every eye in the building pressing against her skin. The hallway windows stretched from floor to ceiling beside her, revealing Manhattan drowned beneath rain and flickering traffic lights. Tiny streams of water crawled down the glass, while distant thunder rolled somewhere above the Hudson River. Naomi stopped beside the window for a moment and closed her eyes briefly. Her reflection stared back at her in the dark glass. Plain housekeeping uniform, tired eyes, hair pulled tightly back beneath fluorescent lighting that made everyone look exhausted. Nothing about her appearance belonged inside billion-dollar financial negotiations. Yet somehow she had become the only person willing to say out loud what everyone else had ignored. Her phone vibrated softly inside her pocket. She pulled it out and saw 3 missed calls from the nursing home in Brooklyn where her mother stayed overnight during treatment weeks. Naomi's chest tightened immediately. She called back at once. Miss Carter, the nurse answered gently. Your mother is resting now. She just wanted to hear your voice earlier. Naomi leaned one shoulder against the cold glass wall and exhaled slowly. Is she okay? She is stable tonight. The word stable lingered in Naomi's mind strangely after everything she had heard inside the boardroom. Stable. Markets needed stability. Banks needed stability. Rich men in expensive suits spent entire careers pretending stability could be bought and controlled forever. But real life had taught Naomi something different years ago. Stability was fragile. One hospital bill, one missed paycheck, one hidden lie buried beneath paperwork. That was all it took for everything to fall apart. Thank you, Naomi whispered before ending the call. She remained by the window afterward, listening to the low hum of the building around her. Somewhere far below, ambulance sirens echoed faintly through the wet streets of Manhattan. A cleaning rag still rested in her hand, damp from untouched coffee rings she never finished wiping from the conference table. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. 2 hours ago, executives barely looked at her. Now entire departments were scrambling because she refused to stay silent. Miss Carter. Naomi turned slowly at the sound of her name. Daniel Reeves stood several feet behind her holding a tablet against his chest. His tie hung loose now, sleeves rolled unevenly to his elbows. He looked younger outside the boardroom somehow. Less polished. More human. I wanted to say thank you, he said quietly. Naomi gave a tired shake of her head. You do not need to thank me. Yes, Daniel replied softly. I really do. The hallway lights reflected against the wet windows between them. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. Most people in that room would have protected themselves first. Naomi looked back toward the storm outside. People like me do not usually get protected by anyone, she answered gently. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, unable to argue with her. Somewhere down the hallway, another conference room door burst open as frightened voices rose again over market projections and legal exposure reports. Tokyo would open soon. The countdown had already begun. But standing there beside the rain-covered windows, Naomi suddenly realized something even more unsettling than the financial collapse itself. The people running the system had not ignored the danger because they were incapable of seeing it. They ignored it because the warning came from someone they never believed mattered enough to be right. At exactly 2:13 in the morning, the first major sell-off hit Tokyo. The alert flashed across every screen inside Whitmore Capital in violent streaks of red that painted the boardroom walls like warning lights inside a sinking ship. Analysts froze mid-sentence. Phones erupted all at once. Market alarms chimed across trading terminals in sharp electronic bursts that seemed almost too loud beneath the silence spreading through the building. Naomi stood alone near the service elevator when she heard the first shout echo from the far hallway. Energy. Executives rushed between offices carrying tablets and legal folders, while financial news stations began appearing across giant wall screens throughout the trading department. Naomi slowly stepped closer toward the open boardroom doors, her pulse tightening with every passing second. Inside, the atmosphere had completely changed. Nobody sat anymore. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of the room, watching live market data collapse in real time across 6 enormous displays. Red numbers poured downward endlessly, while reporters on financial channels spoke with the tense urgency usually reserved for natural disasters. Asian markets are reacting aggressively to leaked exposure concerns tied to American retirement portfolios, one anchor announced. Several investment firms are now halting overnight transfers pending emergency review. Evelyn Brooks gripped the edge of the conference table with both hands, staring at the screens as though refusing to believe what she was seeing. Daniel Reeves moved rapidly between terminals, trying to contain the damage already spreading through global markets. The freeze orders are multiplying, he said breathlessly. If New York opens like this in 4 hours, panic selling starts immediately. Richard said nothing. The glow from the collapsing market charts reflected sharply across his face, while rain hammered the windows behind him hard enough to sound like static. Naomi remained near the doorway, unnoticed for a moment inside the chaos. Then one financial reporter spoke words that silenced the entire room instantly. Sources now claim internal warnings about hidden leverage structures may have been ignored before tonight's transfer attempt. Nobody moved. Evelyn slowly turned toward Richard, her face pale beneath the overhead lights. Richard looked back toward the trading screens, jaw tight enough to show through the shadows beneath his cheekbones. The truth had escaped the building now. It no longer belonged to private conversations inside polished conference rooms. Millions of people would wake up to headlines by morning. Retirement funds, public pensions, economic panic. Naomi felt a strange sadness settle quietly into her chest, not because wealthy executives were frightened, but because ordinary people always paid first when powerful people gambled recklessly. Suddenly, Daniel stopped typing. His hands froze above the keyboard while his eyes widened at something appearing on screen. "Sir," he whispered. Richard stepped closer immediately. "What is it?" Daniel swallowed hard before answering. The emergency reversal worked. The room went completely silent. Daniel enlarged the market feed across the center display. "Because we halted the transfer before completion, the automated exposure chain broke apart before reaching domestic retirement systems." One executive exhaled sharply into both hands. Another collapsed slowly into a chair, as if his knees no longer trusted him to stand. Evelyn stared at the screen without speaking. Richard looked toward Naomi then. Really looked at her. Not through her. Not around her. At her. The room followed his gaze seconds later. Naomi suddenly became painfully aware of the cleaning rag still folded in her hand, and the plain housekeeping badge clipped awkwardly against her uniform. She looked exactly the same as she had hours earlier when they laughed at her. But now nobody laughed. Richard walked slowly across the room until he stood only a few feet away from her. The storm outside reflected dim silver light across the polished floor between them. "You saved this company tonight," he said quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment before answering softly. "No, sir." Richard frowned slightly. Naomi looked back toward the screens where market losses continued slowing little by little. "I just refused to ignore what everyone else was too comfortable to see." By 4:30 in the morning, the storm over Manhattan had finally begun to weaken. Rain still slid slowly down the towering glass walls of Whitmore Capitol, but the thunder had faded into distant rumbles somewhere beyond the river. Inside the building, exhaustion settled over every floor like fog after battle. Analysts sat slumped over glowing monitors. Coffee cups covered conference tables. Television anchors on muted financial channels continued discussing the crisis that almost shattered international markets only hours earlier. But the panic had slowed. The collapse had stopped just short of disaster. Naomi Carter quietly pushed her cleaning cart through the nearly empty executive hallway while pale blue dawn crept into the skyline outside. The wheels rolled softly across marble floors, still reflecting the cold overhead lights. Most people no longer looked at her with dismissal now. They looked uncertain, careful, as though they no longer knew where she belonged in the building. Naomi stopped outside the main boardroom and glanced through the glass walls. Richard Whitmore stood alone near the windows, hands in his pockets, staring down at the city waking beneath him. Without the crowded room around him, he looked older somehow, less untouchable. His reflection stretched faintly across the rain-streaked glass beside him. Naomi turned to continue walking when his voice stopped her gently. "Miss Carter." She paused and looked back. Richard stepped away from the windows slowly. "Built my career believing intelligence always rises to the top." About something else in lower voices whenever elevators opened or conference room doors closed. They talked about the maid who saw the disaster before the executives did. Morning sunlight spilled across lower Manhattan in soft gold reflections as employees streamed through the glass lobby, carrying laptops and paper coffee cups. The building felt different now, quieter in certain ways, more careful. Naomi Carter stepped through the revolving front doors wearing a simple black suit and low heels instead of her old housekeeping uniform. The security guards near the lobby desk straightened immediately when they saw her. One even nodded respectfully before pressing the elevator button for her without being asked. Naomi still was not fully used to that. The elevator climbed smoothly toward the executive floors while soft instrumental music drifted through hidden ceiling speakers. Naomi stood alone inside the mirrored walls watching her reflection carefully. Same calm eyes, same posture, same woman. Only now people paused long enough to see her before deciding who she was. The elevator doors opened onto the 72nd floor, and conversations near the trading area softened almost instantly. Analysts looked up from their screens. Assistants stepped aside in the hallway. Nobody mocked her anymore. Nobody laughed quietly behind expensive sleeves. Naomi walked forward steadily beneath the glow of market boards stretching across the walls. International indexes moved in calm streams of green now. Stable. Safe. Ordinary people across the country would never fully understand how close those numbers came to destroying millions of lives. But Naomi understood. Because people from neighborhoods like hers always understood what financial collapse actually looked like after television cameras disappeared. Daniel Reeves spotted her first near the conference wing and offered a small smile. "Morning, Naomi." "Morning, Daniel." His desk overflowed with market reports and compliance reviews now. Since the crisis, Whitmore Capital had created an entirely new oversight division focused on risk transparency. Daniel glanced toward the office corridor before lowering his voice slightly. "Richard is already waiting." Naomi nodded once and continued walking. As she passed the executive boardroom, she noticed workers removing the old nameplate from Preston Hale's former office. The polished brass letters disappeared into a cardboard box without ceremony. No speeches, no dramatic announcements. Just quiet consequences unfolding one piece at a time. Naomi finally reached the corner office overlooking Manhattan. The door stood partially open. Richard Whitmore looked up from his desk as she entered, sunlight stretching across stacks of financial reports beside him. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said calmly. Naomi smiled faintly. "You know you can call me Naomi now." Richard allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile in return. "I'm still getting used to the fact that you work here voluntarily." Naomi glanced toward the windows where sunlight reflected brilliantly across the river beyond the city skyline. Weeks ago, she had stood in this same building holding a damp cleaning rag while executives debated whether her voice deserved attention. Now her name sat quietly beside the office door in silver lettering. Naomi Carter, Senior Risk Assessment Consultant. She still found herself staring at it sometimes in disbelief.